So let me just flat out ask you, are we in a bubble?
Well, if we're not in a bubble now, there certainly will be a bubble.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of The Circuit. I am Ben Bajarin.
Greetings, programs. I'm Jay Goldberg.
We have a very special guest today, a friend of Jay and I. As a matter of fact, this particular person is the reason that Jay and I met in the first place. Benedict Evans, great to have you. How are you doing?
Good to see you both.
So maybe just give everybody a little quick, who is Benedict Evans, the journey that you've been on, and what you're up to today, and we'll jump into some questions.
Ooh, what's my journey? So I spent the first 5 years of my career as an equity analyst, starting in the dot-com bubble. I was terrible at that. And then I spent about 5 years in industry doing strategy at some big media and telecoms companies, and then was a consultant for a while, and then spent 5 or 6 years in the Valley at Andreessen Horowitz, which is where we all met. That was like 2014 to 19. And then since then, I've been working for myself. And so I do now twice a year a big presentation. I do a newsletter, I have a website and a blog. And I try and explain, analyze what are the strategic shifts around technology in general, like what's happening now, what does it mean, what might happen, how are people trying to win, what matters, what's interesting. And then I go out around the world and explain that to boards of big companies, strategy days, client events, conferences, things like that.
Yes, excellent. I hope everybody is used to checking out Benedict's presentation that he gives. It's a great deck. Obviously, today AI is a big one. I know you had a good chunk of analysis on said AI. So most of today's topics will be around that, and obviously some chip stuff that we throw in. So let's just jump off sort of first topic, right? How do you sort of look at the stage of development for AI right now, and maybe use past cycles as well as a good sort of analogy as to where we're at, right? And as the state of this particular technological development.
Yeah, I think there's as I always say, there's probably a couple of ways to answer this. One of them is like we're in the sort of 1997, 1998, maybe 99 stage of the internet, or the like 2008, 9, 10 stage of smartphones, where it's clear this is a huge deal. Everyone's very excited. Lots of people going out and building stuff. There's products you can hold in your hand and use that are real. But on the other hand, you don't really know how any of this is going to evolve. It's not really clear what the products are going to look like, where the value capture is going to be, which of the people that are out there right now are going to fade away and disappear. And so it's clear this is a huge deal. It's not completely clear yet how this is all going to work. Maybe the second way of thinking about this is that we've gone from like a science project that came out of a non-profit 3 years ago to now there are many different bits of the story you can tell. So there's a capital markets financing debt story. There's are the Chinese going to catch up and copy ASML and chip story. There's a data center construction and power consumption story. There's what's going on in the science of the models, like how much better are they going to get and how do we know and what might happen. And, Jan LeCun says this and Ilya Sutskever says that. There's how are the giant existing platform companies reacting and how well is OpenAI trying to break into that? And then there is what does consumer adoption look like, enterprise adoption look like? How do you separate the people in the Valley who say, oh my God, this has changed my life, I use this all the time, from people outside the Valley who mostly don't and mostly use it once a week or once a month? And how is that going to change? And how does that relate to what the product is and how the product might need to change? How does that turn into companies? Are they going to be winner-takes-all effects? Are the model companies going to do the whole thing, or is this going to play out like every previous generation? So you've got like the splintering of it apart from like the science into all the different parts of the value chain. And so then you become and sort of specialization within that. But the thing that I always come back to is that we kind of don't know how this is going to work. and we can draw some lessons from the way that previous platform shifts have happened. There are all these phrases like, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And you can kind of try and think, well, how does this kind of thing tend to work?
Okay. So let me just flat out ask you, are we in a bubble?
Well, if we're not in a bubble now, there certainly will be a bubble. I had a conversation with a strategy group at a big professional services company yesterday, and we're having these conversations about like usage and how much you use it and how much is it going to change. And it struck me that like maybe the purest sign that you're in a bubble is FOMO, where you feel like, I don't really believe this, but all these idiots are getting rich. And, you remember having that feeling in the NFT thing? Like, this is obviously nonsense, but like, hey, people are getting rich. And the sense that I have that specifically is around the sort of, does just as the general purpose chatbot just change everything? And is that going to be all my compute? Or when I look at that and feel, well, yes, maybe for some people, some of the time, but no, it needs an awful lot more product on that. Am I being too skeptical? Should I just like let go? And when you feel yourself saying, should I just let go? That's a very kind of bubbly sort of moment.
Yeah.
It's also that's also an unfalsifiable statement.
Right.
But it is that sort of feeling of like, there's a joke about a Texas wildcatter who goes to heaven, and he's at the gates of pearly gates, and there's like a whole crowd of people in front of him, and he goes, "Hey, oil's been discovered in hell," and everyone in front of him in the queue rushes off to hell, and then he starts following them, and who is it? Like, who's the guy at the gates? And Peter says, "Wait, where are you going?" And he says, "Well, it might be true."
It might be true.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly remember that feeling in like 2006 around real estate, right? I'd go to social activities, neighborhood barbecues, and like all anyone would talk about was real estate. Should I buy an apartment building? That kind of stuff. But I don't know that we're quite there yet. But certainly there are parts of it to me that seem like, yeah, like I look at some of these.
But this is where the bubble's going. You can certainly see this is where the bubble's going to be.
Yeah.
All the stuff around, debt financing and data center construction and Oracle and, private, you can have a whole capital markets conversation around, $100 million startup seed rounds, $250 million seed rounds. But that's also kind of the problem is that's the nature of like the giant thing that's working. I mean, my old boss, Mark Andreessen, had this line that, all the failed .com ideas from the 90s would work now.
Yeah.
Yeah. Almost all of them, I mean, he was saying, I think he was saying the other day that like pets.com is like the archetype of the incredibly stupid .com idea. And guess what? Chewy is like a $10 billion company.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like it worked. It just didn't work then.
Yeah. I mean, that's the way I usually describe it. I say MySpace and Webvan had to die to get us Facebook.
Yeah. Chewy's a $14 billion company.
Right. Right.
Yeah. The thing I think is interesting is like, again, you look at past and I don't love when people, view this as in line with something like an industrial revolution, but you look and say like how transformational is a technology. Like I've used this example, others have as well, around like electricity. Is it the kind of thing that really changes everything? To what degree does that change everything? And then, to what degree does that, does the future look drastically different, than the present based on a fundamental technology, right? Automotive, maybe even trains, right? Those were things that I think you can draw some interesting parallels to. But, what I keep coming back to too, and I'll be curious, like your take on this around adoption is, when you first tried GPT, you were like, this doesn't really require new hardware. Like anybody with a computer and a smartphone in their pocket, this can diffuse very quickly. Now, again, it's still, it's not 100% of people using it, but we're still early in that adoption cycle. But it's not like smartphones that required you to go buy a piece of hardware or getting a laptop. You had to go get a new hardware. You need to get the internet, right?
You're standing on the shoulders of giants. The Netscape launch, there were, pick a number, 50 to 100 million PCs on Earth. And now something between 5 and 6 billion people have got a smartphone. So yes, you can get to 800 or 900 million weekly active users. And it's both an unfair comparison and a relevant one. It's like, yes, of course it can get to users quicker, but yes, it can get to users way quicker. Then it turns out that the lag is on the back end on the data center construction rather than on the users buying devices. But I think there's another part to this, which is I think particularly something like ChatGPT comes looking like more of a product than it is.
Mm.
And some of that is that the models looked much better than they were, and the models are now much better. But the other part of it is, and I think this is a really sort of fundamental debate, which hasn't really changed in 3 years, is, are you just going to go to a blank prompt and ask it to do the thing? Or do you need that to be wrapped in product and user experience and use cases and design and, a bunch of people sitting and thinking about how can we make this useful for you? How much does it need to be wrapped in use cases? And, this is a conversation I was having yesterday. How much of that is like, you're old, you don't get it? How much of that is people who don't get it? People, you need imagination, you need to let go and think, this is what I could do with this. And we had some of that with things like spreadsheets or with Excel, or realizing, it's the thing with mobile that, we all thought that mobile was basically a PC accessory, and it turned out that mobile turned PCs into a mobile accessory. But some of it is also like, typical big company has got 400 or 500 SaaS apps, and they're all doing something you could do in Excel, or you could do in Oracle, or you could do it in Salesforce. And the reasons those apps exist nonetheless is partly that someone had to go out and build that, and you yourself as some person in HR or finance or something couldn't build that. But it's also a bunch of people thought really hard about, let's work out what the problem is. And let's work out that there is this task that you have that you didn't realize you were doing every day. Right. And that this would be the right way of doing it. And we turn it into this other thing, and then it will work better. And when you just give somebody sitting in accounts payable a prompt and say, there you are, it can do anything for you, the response is going to be like, what? And so I just keep coming back to thinking, no, the job of the entrepreneur is to answer that question. It's not the user's job to answer that. It's the entrepreneur's job to answer that.
Yeah.
So are you saying that ChatGPT needs a lot of product people? Is that
I think
as simple as
not ChatGPT itself, and I think it's obviously a lot of what you can see in the last 6 months is, people at ChatGPT hired a whole bunch of product people, and they started shipping ideas and throwing ideas out there like, throwing mud on the wall.
Yeah.
But some of it is also, is that just another button in ChatGPT, or is that an app? And how many buttons am I going to end up with? Am I going to end up with a ribbon? And then, of course, finishing the joke, am I then going to end up with Clippy saying, hey, did you realize, does ChatGPT need Clippy?
Right.
But that's the sort of puzzle. One of the ways I keep thinking about this is that the function of a GUI, like the GUI has two functions. The first function is you don't need a keyboard command anymore. You remember those cardboard overlays that you had on keyboards? Like, I'm just old enough to remember those. Like, you have this kind of cardboard overlay you put on your computer keyboard that would tell you like what all the keyboard commands were, so you would know how to do stuff. And a GUI means you don't need that, and a GUI means you can have hundreds of features and the user can find them, at least theoretically, without having to have like a manual and memorize keyboard commands. But the second function of a GUI is that you're at this stage in a workflow, and there's 5 things you should do here. And there's a huge amount of institutional knowledge and careful thought and imagination and inspiration around realizing, no, these are the things that should be on this screen at this stage in the workflow. This is what we should suggest to the user. And does the user have to work that out from first principles every time? Do you load that into the system prompt that you give to the LLM so that the LLM is dynamically generating a UI? How much pre-thought, so to speak, does there have to be into that process? And how much does the LLM have to kind of work it out, or the user have to work it out? And I don't think those are questions that have easy answers. Again, it's like looking at the web in 97 and saying, how is this going to work? An awful lot of what happened was stuff that you really would not have predicted or expected.
Right.
But I think there's a lot of people right now. I mean, as this thing I keep coming back to, there's a lot of people who use ChatGPT. They've got an account, they've got the app, they get it, they know how to use it. They're not paying for it, and they use it once a week, and they can't think of anything to do with it today. And that's far more people than the people who are using it every day.
For those who can't see, I'm raising my hand. I'm in that camp. I have a paid subscription.
I mean, I think you break this down a couple of ways, and I actually completely agree with your point about more productization to get us to diffuse this entirely, right? I just look at like, I'm an early adopter. I remember when GPT came out, like I tested everything. I would test everything I could possibly do, find what it can do and what it can't do. And every time models come out, I push it to its limits to figure out, well, this, what can I do that I couldn't do before? What are the things that'll optimize my workflows? But not everybody's going to do that. Like my wife does not do that. She's a late adopter at best, tail end of the laggard. Like give her ChatGPT and she sits there and she's like, I don't know what to do, with the exception of some new use cases that have shown up around education and helping create lesson plans and doing some flashcards and things like that. But that's not entirely obvious. Like I had to still show her how to do all of that stuff. So I do think, right, I do think exactly your point is right, is to get past the 20 to 30% early diffusers, it's going to take those things, those turnkey things. And I'm actually really curious how you think this fleshes out into like operating systems. Like what would the smartphone OS need to do to make this obvious? Because right now it's been terrible. I don't know. I don't know what to click on to edit a text, right? And that's basic, but I think it needs to come at a systems level.
Well, there's maybe two answers to this. One of them is like, think of a use case like, take a photograph of a recipe and then take a photograph of your fridge and say, hey, use Instacart to order whatever I don't have. Now, these systems can kind of do that now. They might get something wrong. You might have to check, but they'll basically be able to do that. Is that something that you should do in ChatGPT or in Instacart? What should the entry path to that be? How should that work? And again, it kind of comes back to, this phrase, the thin wrapper. So, in that scenario, Instacart would be like a thin wrapper. Of course, the real thin wrappers are all the apps that the model labs put out. ChatGPT is a thin wrapper. It's an input box and an output box and nothing else. But I remember, like, both of you know Steven Sinofsky, who I worked with at A16Z, and he was sort of pointing out that in the late, kind of mid to late 90s, people were saying this about Windows. That the operating system is, because before GUIs, like your word processor had to do printing and graphics and file storage and everything else. And now with Windows, the operating system was doing all of that. So what was left for the application? Well, it was just like a thin wrapper on some Win32 APIs.
Yeah.
Well, basically, all the hard stuff was being done by the operating system, and Microsoft Office is just like a thin Win32 wrapper. But which is kind of technically true if you're Bill Gates, but kind of not true if you're a user. And so you've got this kind of question of like, how generalized and how specific do the use cases become? How much is it that you ask this thing to do anything for you? And I think there's a kind of fascinating kind of challenge in here, because actually going back to Bill Gates, he was talking about this like 2-3 years ago. Was saying this is the biggest thing since the GUI, because with a GUI you didn't need to memorize keyboard commands, so you have this massive expansion in what software can be. But someone still needs to have made that piece of software. So if you want to do your taxes on a computer, someone needs to have made a piece of tax software. Whereas in principle, I could just ask ChatGPT, hey, just don't do my taxes for me. And so you could have this huge expansion in how much stuff could be done in software without needing individual pieces of software. The problem is, most of those use cases, the user doesn't think like that. So you kind of do need that piece of software still.
Right.
I mean, I had this conversation with a sort of CIO at a big retailer a couple of weeks ago, and it kind of occurred to me that like there's this question like, should I do this in Oracle, or should I export it into a CSV and do it in Excel, or should I do it in a SaaS app? Like, to solve this problem generically, is it best done using the general purpose tools in Oracle, SAP, or Salesforce or something, or in a vertical SaaS app that unbundles like graduate recruit hiring or something, or accounts payable reconciliation into some specific SaaS application, which is why every Big company has 400 or 500 SaaS apps. They're all unbundling SAP or Oracle. Or the third case is, do I export a CSV and do it in Excel? And maybe now what ChatGPT does is it's a fourth option on that scale. It will enable massively more SaaS apps because now there'll be this whole class of stuff you can make a piece of software to do that you couldn't do before. But there will also be this question of like, should I do that in Excel? Should I do that in ChatGPT? Should I do it in the dedicated vertical app? Should I do it in the horizontal app? And I don't think the answer is you'll just do all of it in the dedicated in ChatGPT.
Agreed.
And I almost feel like I feel like it's weird to even have to say that. And then there's the 2-hour podcast where we talk about how we'll have human level PhD researchers next year.
Yes.
Which is a very weird split. I mean, I've said this a bunch. It's like the last OpenAI, one of the last OpenAI videos, they spend the first 20 minutes saying we're going to have human level AI researchers. And then they say, oh, also we're going to have thousands of ISVs. Like, well, which is it? Either you can have the software as a person, or no, you're going to have loads of independent vertical pieces of software, but not both.
Yeah. Well, and I think within ChatGPT, like OpenAI, that's the tensions really coming back to front-facing product plus APIs, right? Because I use a bunch of SaaS software that integrates ChatGPT as something that'll just work with the data sets or help you build a model, and it's just using it's just a wrapper, it's just calling APIs for their tokens. But then I also use GPT as a front end for a handful of things, right? And so that's the continued tension. Gemini, Google will be in the same thing. There's APIs, you can use it on your back end SaaS, or you can use it as a front end for X, Y, and Z, I guess, right? There's the two sides of their model.
So I know you talk to a lot of people outside the valley, say outside of tech. What is your impression of, where are they in the sort of thought process behind what AI means, right? You've mentioned you talk to retailers, into services companies, like people who aren't sort of buried in AI like we are. Where are they in this?
So several answers. One of them is there's a lot of survey data you can see, which is basically every big company has got a whole bunch of pilots and trials and experiments, and those are distributed across different functions, much as you would expect. More of them in programming and marketing and customer support, and much less of them in things like HR and legal, where this stuff doesn't work as well. And it's sort of 2/3. It's like, I don't know, pick a number. 2/3 of people have got pilots, and 1/3 of that's gone into production, depending on what field you're looking at. And then you can compare this with stuff like cloud, where there's these charts I always show of like enterprise cloud adoption is something like 1/3 of workflows after 20 years. So that's one answer, which is, it will take time, and you'll do it one use case at a time. And no, you're not going to rip out that thing you bought because it's not fully depreciated yet. Like, why doesn't a company move from on-prem to cloud? Well, because that's moved from CapEx to OpEx, and that will hit their EPS, and then the CFO's bonus won't go up next year. There's a lot of why haven't we replatformed our company? Well, because the CIO says that it will be 20% more efficient, but guess what? We've got other stuff we need to do this year than replatform and buy the shiny new thing for the CTO. So there's a lot of those kinds of traditional IT procurement kinds of conversations. I think there's a second answer is I've met a fairly big company CEO who said to me, how do I make my people use AI?
Yeah.
Which to me is like saying, how do I make people use the web in 1997? Now, I will give everybody in the company a proxy account and install Netscape on their computer, and we put a T1 line into the building, and we did productivity go up. Why not? What went wrong?
Yeah.
Obviously, the web's useless. Right. And there's a lot of that kind of, there's a lot of that. There's a bunch of that stuff. I think there's also, even, in the same room, and very often in the same room, we've got some people who are, I'm using this for everything, it's changed my life, and other people who are saying, I can't rely on it and get stuff wrong. The example I always give here, which I've used in presentations in the past, is to think about software spreadsheets, which arrive in the late 70s. And Dan Brooklyn, and I've forgotten his co-founder's name, who created VisitCalc, they would show this to CPAs, and they would say, you can change the interest rate here, and all the other numbers change. And the CPA would say that was a week of work, and you did it in 10 seconds, like almost literally. Because, some spreadsheets were paper. And so if the point of the story is that if you were an accountant and you saw VisitCalc, this changed your life. It was something over $10,000 adjusted for inflation to buy an Apple II to run this thing. This was obviously amazingly useful. If you were a lawyer, you would look at that and say, well, I don't do that. I mean, maybe next week when I'm doing my timesheet, that might be useful for me, which is exactly that maybe next week I'll use ChatGPT for that thing. But that's not what I do every day. What I do every day is another thing. And for that, I need a word processor. And then you've got the whole conversation about, well, yes, but, when I was a student, I did an internship at a solicitor's in London, and they still had secretaries who took dictation and then had little pedals on the floor as they typed out the dictation onto their word processors. So there's a lot of other stuff that kind of needs to change. And lawyers, CPAs all got spreadsheets in the early 80s, and lawyers all got, took a lot longer. Took a lot longer to get PCs. And I think this is the way a lot of people, it's kind of the way Jay and I look at ChatGPT. It's like, well, that's great, but that's not what I do today. I might use it next week. I'll think of something. But the day-to-day of what you're actually thinking about all the time doesn't map very well against this. There are some people who are the accountants seeing the spreadsheet. If you're a software developer, if you're a marketer, if you're doing customer support, amazing right now. If you're a lawyer or you're doing HR, then it's very cool. But you need a lot more energy and imagination to think of things that you could do with this.
Yes.
And there's a lot more work to work out what you would do with that. And you kind of think like, I would like a piece of software that would do like trivial use case. Like yesterday, I pulled a US Census report from like 2005 of people employed as accountants and bookkeepers every 10 years in the US since 1900. And it's a chart with no numbers. So there I am. I open up Xscape and I'm measuring pixels on this chart and typing them into spreadsheet to back calculate what are the values on this chart. I would love to be able to give that to ChatGPT. It will get numbers wrong.
Yes. Yeah. No, and I think that again, right, just emphasizes what it takes to diffuse. And exactly to your point, which sort of we talked about a while ago, which was like the only way I could get Jen to use this was she saw how it solves a pain point in her teaching use cases, and that was the only way. Like she looked at it and was like, yeah, this is going to save me a bunch of, like, everybody has to find that thing that solves use cases. But that's the thing, like we were talking about, I don't know how obvious that is, right, to everybody.
And isn't that the entrepreneur's job? It's the entrepreneur's
job. It should be, yes.
So I think there's an interesting kind of abstraction point here, because there's the difference between you have to know how to write the code, but you've also got to think of that's the thing that you should be coding. So I'm just old enough to remember, like, the early 80s of PCs, the idea was like a small business person would buy a PC and they'd buy C++ and they would write their own software.
Right.
Or you'd buy a database program and you'd make a database. And that's not how it worked. How it worked is you buy a piece of accounting software or stock control system or a piece of software that does the thing that you need. You don't make it yourself. And one reason you don't make it yourself is because it's really hard and you'd have to know how to write code. But another reason is you'd have to work out how it should work. You'd have to work out what are the problems. What is it that this thing should do? Yeah. And that's, the LLM solves the first half of that up to a point. But doesn't really solve the second half. You're still going to have to sit and scratch your head and work out from first principles, what is it that I want this thing to do for me? And that's the job of an entrepreneur. I mean, every one of those 400 or 500 SaaS apps is basically a database. I mean, this is, it's a Y Combinator joke. Airbnb is just a CMS. It's like, well, yes, but no.
Right. Yes, exactly.
Every one of those 400 or 500 SaaS apps is just a SQL wrapper. Like, well, yes, but no.
Yes, exactly. I think that's exactly the point. And that's to the point about how this gets productized. And I'm going to botch this joke, but I had heard somebody say it like as a narrative, right? That somebody was challenged by the CEO or mandated by the CEO to get Copilot for all of their customers. So they paid $30 per, how many employees they had. And the CEO was just so happy. And then he kept coming back saying, but nobody's using it. I can't get anybody to use it for all these same things, which was exactly what you're saying. Like, I don't know how to put it in my workflow if I have to be the one that figures out how to do it. It needs to be click a button, get it out.
There was a version of this, Jake, that like 25 years ago, Entity Docomo deployed a cell phone operated vending machine in Shinjuku Station. And then someone asked somebody at Docomo, well, what was the usage profile? And they're like, well, about 40% people who work for Docomo, about 20% people who work for our competitors, people who work for our vendors, people who work for consultants. Any actual customers? No.
Yeah. So would you
remember
say...
Docomo?
I do remember Docomo. Yes.
Yeah.
NTT. So with the way that you look at this, and I also asked this within the context of how this gets paid for with, the broader CapEx discussion, we said, if it's isolated to pockets of the business where it's obvious, right? Like maybe some level of a CRM or customer support, right? Which you're hearing a lot of examples of. It sort of just then makes me think it's going to take a longer time to monetize this, because it's not going to be, if today, right, which I've heard from CIOs, like less than 20% are deploying AI at scale across any department, not the enterprise as a whole, but any department. We have a long time to diffuse it, but people in those departments need to find it valuable. And if that's a challenge here, right, where's value accruing in AI? I just wonder, is this a longer timeline?
Well, either they do that or they buy a piece of software that solves the problem in the old-fashioned traditional way that you buy software that solves the problem. And, again, this has only been around for 3 years. So it does take a while to do that kind of stuff. I think there's we kind of zoom out from this, there's a value capture question here, I think, which is that if the models, as we stand today, like general purpose models are commodities. And they're commodities in the sense that, like, and it's important to make the point that commodity can be very expensive and very difficult, but still be a commodity. But if you look at this week, ChatGPT 5.2 is at the top, and next week it will be Gemini 3.1, and the week after that it will be Claude, and they're all sort of within 5 percentage points on the sort of the more generalized benchmarks. And obviously you can have a whole 2-hour podcast about what benchmarks are and the problems with benchmarks, but there's fundamentally, for a weekly active user, probably wouldn't pass a double-blind test between Gemini, Claude, ChatGPT. Grok would be different because it would start like telling you about how great Hitler was, but like the other ones, you can't really tell the difference. The consumer usage looks completely different. Like it's basically ChatGPT, and then at half the level it's Gemini and Claude and Meta, which is funny because in the Valley Meta's been written off, but from consumer, but the point there is distribution. And then Claude is basically nowhere. Like it has zero consumer awareness, and I think really zero consumer product, which is kind of interesting why Mike Krieger's still there. And so there's a question here, which is, do you just carry on spending the money to make an undifferentiated product with no winner-takes-all effects? Do you just keep hiring more people and throwing more product out there? At what point when do you get to the point that like you're not exactly the same as everybody else's thing, except your logo is different and you've got the buttons arrive in a slightly different order? Do you go up do you go and so then there's down the stack, which is the pure infra, where it's commodity sold at marginal cost, which is what AWS does, and to some extent Azure. Is that what OpenAI wants to do? And it struck me it's kind of interesting to compare the kind of the down the stack point with what happened in semiconductors and also maybe what happened in airliners, which is that with each generation, it's not that there's any particular winner takes all effect in making chips. It's just it's really hard and really expensive. And so with each generation, you had like a step change, fewer companies doing it. And you have ended up with one. It might have been two, but we've ended up with one. What happened in airlines is there's two. And then you've got smaller people like Embraer and so on. But it's not like there's not like a winner takes all effect that locks anyone out from competing with Airbus. It's just you need to spend, I don't know, pick a number of how many tens or hundreds of billions of dollars to get to the point that your planes were as good as Airbus and Boeing. So it's not like a winner takes all effect. There's just capital and technical difficulty, however you want to describe that. Whereas what happened in software was because there wasn't capital, you had to have a network effect. So Microsoft, and so on, those kinds of companies, you have network effects. Whereas airlines or chips, you don't really have network effects. And I'm being deliberately very vague here, but I'm just sort of thinking there's an interesting split there that Microsoft used to have, capex to sales of like 1%, and now it's 45%.
Yeah.
So the question is like, what happens at the infrastructure level and how do you compete there? And then in the middle, in the model, it doesn't seem like there's any way to compete really. And then do you go up the stack and look for network effects? Do you product? Do you unbundle it? Is it about distribution? Will Google just makes it a feature of search? And that's a slightly half-formed thesis, but you see what I mean? There's this sort of split. Like in the middle, the model's all the same. So what happens? Do you make it about the cost of running the model and the efficiency of running the model and building the data centers? Or do you make it about trying to build product on top of the model? Distribution, network effect. Do you make it Sora? Do you bundle it with Google Search? Do you do what? And the question at the end of that is, where does that leave ChatGPT? Where does that leave OpenAI? Because if their models aren't really any better or worse than anybody else's, and they've got to pay whatever they've got to pay to get everyone else at the infra that other people have, and they don't really have distribution the way Google, and they can't bundle. Don't have other stuff they can bundle it with the way Google and indeed Apple and Meta can. So back to the bubble point, what Sam Altman is desperately doing is swapping paper for assets and distribution and product and people before the music stops.
Yes.
I got to ask because
there's many unformed theses in there, but it's just sort of a way of thinking about this.
I think, a lot of that resonates, but what I think I take away from this is this is very, very early. This is earlier than people realize, is what I hear, right? There's so many unformed questions, right? We're not even sure what it is yet, right? And I think about this in the context of mobile phones, right? iPhone comes out in 2007. By 2010, we had Uber and Twitter and Instagram. We had a clear direction of the market, right? And we didn't know exactly who was going to end up. There was still Android versus iOS and whatever. But there was a clear direction, right? And also by 2010, we removed all the sort of limitations. Everyone was buying a smartphone by then. Similar with the internet, I don't know how you want to time it exactly, like when it started, but certainly by 2002, 2003, we had pretty widespread adoption. And really to get there, we had to go through the downturn, and then it started taking off.
Yeah, and we had to get broadband.
And we had to get broadband. Like there was a real physical limitation there. So it doesn't feel like we're anywhere near that with AI. It still seems very, very unformed. Yeah,
there's a diagram I used to show which came from a report by Telegeography from 1995. And the diagram is labeled cyberspace, which is very mid-90s. Yeah. But that was like, it wasn't clear it was going to be the internet. There were all these other things around. Like CompuServe and AOL were not the internet. They were something else. Usenet wasn't the internet, apparently. I think you'd have a whole argument on Usenet about whether Usenet was the internet or something else. Right. And then there's obviously like legacy things like Minitel and stuff, which obviously were going to go away. Within the internet, there was the web, but there was Gopher, there was FTP, there was email. You go and look at, it sounds ridiculous now, but go and look at the early Mary Meeker reports, and she's got separate charts for web use and email use. These are different things. And email use was going to be way higher than web use.
Yeah.
And then it wasn't clear that, I remember I arrived at university in 1995 and I had a Windows 95 PC and I had 5 web servers on my PC because it wasn't clear that this was people thought this was a sharing system. It wasn't clear it was it was a publishing system. So the Tim Berners-Lee's original web browser had an editor in it because he thought this was like a network drive that you would browse to a document and then you would click and you could edit it. And so then Netscape is the thing, but it turns out that the web browser wasn't really the battleground either. This is, the irony of the whole battle of Netscape and Internet Explorer and so on. Google wins it with Chrome, but that turns out not really to be the point. It's actually about search. The value capture ends up being in search and social, which is why all the people who hate how the internet evolved don't really understand. It's like, you needed Google and social on top of it. And, go back to 95, 96. Well, Mark Zuckerberg is in, primary school, and Larry and Sergey are grad students, and Jeff Bezos still dresses like a banker and, hasn't worked out yet, and, runs a bookstore. I mean, have you seen the meme of Jeff Bezos in 1995? It's like, I run a bookstore. Jeff Bezos in 2025, I sell whatever the fuck I want.
Yes, exactly. It's so good.
But that's, exactly Jay's. I'm just recapitulating Jay's point of like that massive uncertainty.
Yes, right. And if you could just distill, I know we've covered some of this, but succinctly, like what do you think some of the pillar flaws we use in thinking about AI are?
AI are not AIR. So I think it's very hard to understand what it is when you're using it. We still now have these cases of lawyers treating it as a, and we only know about it because we hear about it because it's reported, because it's important. Lawyers who think it's a database,
right?
And lawyers who ask for precedents and get things that look like precedents because they don't understand that that's what it does. It makes things that look like a good answer. We've got OpenAI have got 800 or 900 million weekly active users, but only 5% of people are paying. Most people don't really understand what this is. Most people really don't understand how it works. It hasn't made its way out into the real world very much. Everyone sort of touched it and looked at it and scratched their head. I think the thing we haven't really talked about is the data center energy consumption, power consumption, capex side, which to me feels like it's like trying to predict internet usage, bandwidth usage, again in the late 90s. I mean, you could make a spreadsheet in 1998 of what will global data usage be in 5 years.
Right.
And you can imagine, like, what formula, you'd say, well, this many users, using this many web pages, and how big will web pages get, and how will broadband change that, and will there be video, and what kind of video, and what bit rates for how long, or even like trying to calculate, YouTube bandwidth usage. You imagine you're trying to calculate, and this is what, amuses me when Google or so on talk about their token generation. It's just almost literally like being at YouTube and saying, this is how many bits we transmitted last month.
Right.
Okay, well, the number went up, which I guess is good. Is that because you had more users watching the same? Did you have more users watching less? Did you move to a more efficient compression algorithm? Are people watching more? Like, there's so many possible variables of what that could mean. And that's in a world where you kind of knew what the science was. Whereas here, do we go to 10x more reasoning engines? Do we go to viral video generation systems? Do we have more algorithms that mean we can get the same reasoning results for 1% of the token generation? We have no idea. I mean, we don't really know the answers to any of those questions. And so trying to forecast a capex usage, all you can really say is, well, we're behind for now. And if it turns out that the usage collapses next year, we'll fill it up over the next 5 years.
Right.
So if you're the CFO at these companies, it doesn't feel like an unreasonable... The spending at this stage for Meta or for Google doesn't feel particularly unreasonable, but it also feels pretty reasonable to try and start shifting it off into SPVs and putting it onto other people's balance sheets.
Yes.
I mean, the other people's balance sheets is the new other people's money, isn't it?
Yep, absolutely.
So, all right, let me shift gears a little bit because we've kind of touched this little, danced around this. In your latest presentation, you compare Nvidia to Sun, and I love that example because that's where Jensen started, and I can see it, but I'd love to hear you expand on this idea, because Sun is like one of these companies that sort of defines what we're talking about. It was once this great big thing. It was the leading company, and then software changed and it went away.
Yeah, so maybe sort of 2 or 3 answers to this. The first answer is, like, people still talk about Nvidia as selling chips, and it doesn't. Nvidia sells very high-end, very complex, sophisticated computers. They sell the whole box. They sell a supercomputer, call it a mini computer, whatever you want to call it. They sell a computer in which they control most of the technology and most of the chips, but it's not a chip. You don't buy chips from them, you buy a computer. And that's what Sun sold you. They sold you whatever it was, a computer that cost you 10 or 20 times what it cost you to buy a PC and was 10 or 20 times faster. I'm making these numbers up, but just very impressionistically, that was the deal. And it had custom silicon and ran a custom operating system and did all this stuff that you couldn't do on a PC. And over time, the PCs, it was a classic case of, the high-end single-purpose device getting squashed by the growth of Moore's law. There's an old joke, an engineering joke, that a Russian screwdriver is a hammer. You just hit it harder, and that's kind of what Moore's law does to computing. The inefficient general purpose thing gets faster and squashes the efficient high-end single-purpose thing. And so, on several points to the comparison, one of them is, Sun didn't sell chips. Sun sold the complete box, and that's what Nvidia sells. Second example, and including the chip. No, there's a bunch of problems with this analogy because Sun didn't really have that kind of fundamental network effect. And they weren't, again, I'm at the edges of how much I really know about Sun because this is kind of before my time. But the point of buying a Sun box was that it was faster. It wasn't that it did something that you fundamentally couldn't do if you bought enough PCs. It was just way faster and more efficient at a certain level. The story clearly with, what do we want to call them, AI graphics, AI accelerators maybe, is that Nvidia has this CUDA network effect on the top of that. And then we get into a data center economics conversation, which is, frankly, the kind of stuff that you talk about more than me. But the end of the Sun story is that Moore's law just kind of catches up with them and they find themselves trying to outcompete the entire electronics industry. And they get crushed by Moore's law plus the growth of standards plus the fact that everybody's making fast computers, and why is yours? In the end, you're not going to be able to stay ahead of all of those people indefinitely. Now, clearly, we're at the very beginning of that. On the one hand, you have TPUs, you have lots of people, all Google's competitors who would like to have TPUs and are maybe now buying TPUs. And then on the other side, you have Huawei making chips that are, I don't know, like substantially less good, but if you buy enough of them, then you get the same effect if you're a Chinese company. Also very early, right at the beginning of this. But I find it incredibly hard to see a kind of a long-term sustainable situation in which everybody's basically running the same models built on the same technology, on chips that are basically doing the same maths, where there's no fundamental reason why you can't use somebody else's in the long term. And that's a 5 or 10 year story, perhaps. It's certainly not like I'm not articulating a quantifiable bear case for Nvidia. I'm just thinking like deterministically, there is there the lock-in that Intel had? Is there a reason why you have to have that? And I'm not sure. It's not self-evident to me that they have that kind of a lock-in. So happy to be told I'm wrong.
I just want everyone to be clear that was Benedict saying that, not me. So when the hate mail comes, all the Nvidia fanboys out there, that was Benedict.
I mean, I think I wrapped that with a lot of caveats of like, I'm not a chip analyst. I'm just looking very, very deterministically. The models are kind of all the same, and the math is kind of all the same. So why should there be long-term defensible, whatever the fuck Nvidia's margins are?
70-ish%, maybe low 60s, high 60s, whatever. But I think the critique that you hit on is exactly, a fair one. I look at it a little bit differently from, just the levels of differentiation or performance gap, but more to like, is this like Intel was, where eventually everything's just fast enough, right? You don't look at your agent takes a second, not 10 minutes anymore. Like, how much faster does it need to get, right? At which point we've got a lot of compute, and then what happens, right? That's, to me, like history has proven that point, that you get to a point like the internet got fast enough, right? What was it? What was a millisecond faster to run to load my webpage? And that, I think that's a reasonable place we end up too. Maybe not, but I would say we've seen that pattern before, that it's good enough, and good enough, to exactly to your point, is hard to compete with other people when everything's relatively good enough.
Maybe some of that, I think, well, not maybe, very clearly, some of that depends on how specific the use cases get. So, clearly you're going to have the voice recognition model, the image editing model running locally on your phone. And now it takes 30 seconds, and then over time it will take, those things will become commoditized. How much the model stops getting better? I mean, isn't this the big scientific question? Do the models, sort of as we are now, get better, or do we go to the human level models that are sort of almost the quasi-religious question? I always call this vibes forecasting, because there's no theoretical, we don't have a theoretical model for how this works. So when, Andrej Karpathy or Jeff Dean or, Jeff or Jan LeCun or whoever, Jan LeCun says, now it's not getting there, and Demet says, now it's not getting there, and Ilias says maybe, and so-and-so says, no one knows. Like, it's purely an impressionistic sense of what do you feel is going to happen. And, yes. On the other side, well, what does enough mean for how much compute?
Yeah, sure.
If everything is being, if we automate massively more processes and create massively more things that we weren't doing before and make way more devices, then yes, it might flatten out, but not for 20 years.
Right.
I mean, this is the thing with mobile bandwidth. Now, mobile bandwidth is arguably only now starting to flatten out. So eventually, yes, obviously, if you don't believe if you believe in AGI, then who the hell knows? But absent that, yes, it will flatten out at some point, but that could take quite a long time.
Yes, that I agree with too. Yes. All right, we've covered a ton of ground. I think we've made a good.
We've explained
a good. Yes. We've almost solved all the world's problems, but maybe next time. But we will wrap there. Benedict, greatly appreciate your time and your insights. I encourage everybody to check out his website and his presentation, which is on YouTube, right? I believe you have your presentation.
Yes, if you Google Benedict Evans, it'll take you there, and there's the presentation and the PDF and the video of me in Helsinki.
Always a fantastic presentation. We appreciate your time and the conversation, and we will talk to you all later.
Thank you.
Thank you, Benedict. Thank you, everybody, for listening.